Richard Sermon is a graduate of the Dorset Institute of Higher Education, now Bournemouth University, and the University of Southampton, with almost 40 years professional engagement in British field archaeology and heritage protection. His formal career began at the Museum of London, where as a senior archaeologist, he supervised excavations in the historic city of London, and in 1990 correctly identified the Gresham Street medieval mikveh, Jewish ritual bath. He went on to hold senior positions as deputy director of the Scottish Urban Archaeological Trust, and following a move into local government, as city archaeologist for Gloucester, and finally as county archaeologist for Bath and Northeast Somerset. He has related interests in musicology, linguistics, and folklore, having written on various subjects ranging from medieval bone flutes and the origins of the pipe and tabor, to the philology of wassailing and the use of folkloric motifs in the 1973 cult horror film The Wicker Man. His work has been published in Bristol and Avon Archaeology, Current Archaeology, Decius, Folklore, Levensis, Jewish Historical Studies, Northern History, Oxoniensis, Time and Mind, and the Proceeding of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, along with other periodicals and journals. In his newest book, which is Easter, a Pagan Goddess, a Christian Holiday, and their Contested History, Richard returns to the subject of early calendars and festivals in Britain and Ireland, pulling together strands of his earlier work and introducing a wide range of new and previously under-researched material. With that said, I happily turn the floor over to Richard Sermon.
Well, thank you very much, Leonard, for that introduction. I was hoping you might have gone for the shorter one, so but thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Yes, a response really now to Stephen Pollington's, extensive conversation, about the Matrone, and just unbelievable depth of knowledge that Stephen has. I have quite a number of his books on my shelves here at home, so thank you for that. So let us, right, I'm just trying to move the slides forward. Where are we? Here we go. Oh, now there it is. Right, here we go. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Steve, for giving us this outline of your forthcoming book, as I believe it. I've been led to believe you're working on the Matrone, and for sharing your presentation in advance with me, and at least giving me a crib, so I had the opportunity to work up a few responses to what has been, quite a deep dive that you've given us. I'd like to start really with your conclusions on the Matrone, and I sort of out of that I drew that that they appear in groups, usually in threes, triads. They are connected to motherhood in some way, so let's say mothers. That they foresee and shape the future, both for infants and for adults. So prediction, foreseeing the future, and that they provide assistance to those who ask it of them, and sustenance in the case of the earthen mother, and in terms of their origin, that you suggest that they belong to an older stratum of mythology. And also the interesting parallels that you observe between the Matrone and the principal examples that you've worked through, the Feen or wise women in Sleeping Beauty, the Old Norse Nornia, the Norns, the Anglo-Saxon Modranecht, the Matres and the Matrone, the Old Norse Amdicia, the ladies, and of course Erche, the earthen Modor, and the weird sisters in Shakespeare's Macbeth. But I thought it might be useful just to have a quick recap through these. So I hope you don't mind, but I sort of took your extensive text and tabulated it slightly, which is, I know, a bit sort of there we are. So working through the first three, sort of you had the fairy godmothers, the French fée or German fiend in Sleeping Beauty, I think it's seven good wise women and one bad one in the French version. The Grimm brothers working up to 12 good well, fairy godmothers as they become in the English versions, and one who sort of casts a curse to, curses Briar Rose, whilst the others bless and protect her. The Norns and the Nonia, the triads of unworldly prophetic females who shape the lives of men. The Mother's Night in Bede's De Temporum Ratione, the night that precedes the new year. Traditional celebrations of these mothers are supposed to have had a long history in that culture. You have the matres and the matrone. A particular interest to my discussions in my book, obviously, the matrone Austria Hene, which have been linked to by some writers to Bede's goddess Eostre. And again, sort of, often when they're depicted they are shown in threes, but they have a sort of an enigmatic and much debated role as sort of localized mothers and matron cults. And with that cluster that you quite rightly identify in the Lower Rhine region, which is, of course, where the Matrene Austria Hene sit. And there are numerous sort of Roman period altars associated, and at least 2 or 3 temple sites that have been excavated associated with these cults. The Disio, the ladies of our Old Norse tradition, the sort of consecrated female beings with their prophetic powers. And then the Urche, the Mother Earth of the Acobot, the field remedy from the 10th century, this benevolent female deity who provides cures for unproductive land. And then, lastly, of this sort of the 7 principal ones, I think that you identified the weird or wayward sisters in Shakespeare's Macbeth, and the weird, obviously the Old English weird in that sense, but also in Lowland Scots, weird was simply used as it was in Old English to mean the fates. So that link with the parquet again, I think that is well worth exploring. But I think what I did, I hope you don't mind, I sort of tabulated your sort of initial thoughts by sort of cross-referencing the 7 major examples that you worked through against your conclusions of the sort of the triads, whether they accord with being triads, whether they agree with it being mothers, prediction, and whether they provide assistance. And whilst you can see that range of characteristics across those you identify, I don't think one of them exists. You can't say that that either any one of those examples has all of those traits. But of course, that's what you would expect as things have developed over time, acquiring new characteristics, losing some. But it is a very interesting pattern. Such comparative mythology, is an extremely valuable tool. But linking evidence from different time periods and geographical locations also has its dangers, and I think you've worked through a number of those. The example that I look at in my book is where Philip Shaw has suggested that Eostre was a local goddess at Eastry in Kent, whose development he sees as being sort of paralleling that of the Matrone Austria Hene, which are also very localized in the area of the sort of the Lower Rhine region in Germany. To assess this theory, I suggest that we need to begin by looking at whether the 2 cults have any shared attributes in common. A question that was succinctly answered for me by folklorist Stephen Winnick at the Library of Congress. And I quote here, the Matrone Austria Hene are triple goddesses for whom it was customary to leave inscriptions on stone, while Eostre was a single goddess who has no inscription that has ever been found, but for whom it was customary to celebrate an April. So in other words, the 2 goddess concepts don't really appear to have any attributes in common. But that's not really what Shaw says. He doesn't suggest that they do. What he does is he suggests that they are parallel developments that reflect sort of common naming practices within early Germanic culture, exhibiting sort of 3 shared characteristics as group-specific local deities that derive their name from a sort of small-scale social group or area, and are defined in some way as Eastern, with reference, to neighboring groups and areas. However, apart from their cognate deity names and female gender, there really is no evidence that the 2 goddess concepts actually share these attributes or characteristics. while the Matrone Ostrohene was certainly a very localized cult with temple site, likely to have existed in the Morkenhaft area, which is where the Matrone Ostrohene were found, there is no proof that this term was derived from the local sort of social geography, or that it served as a name for a sort of local grouping or sub-tribal group. Conversely, whilst the earliest examples of the place name Eastry in Kent shows that there may well have been an eastern sort of sub-regional or tribal kingdom in that area, the inhabitants may have borne and that the inhabitants may have borne a related name. There's no evidence to suggest that the cult of Eostre was specifically connected with Eastry or the surrounding part of Kent. So what Shaw seems to be doing is taking the evidence from one of these cults or locations and then inferring its existence in the other cult or location and vice versa. So sort of filling in the gaps for either. And I think that's always the danger within sort of, the comparative mythology. Now, that being said, it's perfectly reasonable to compare, the Matres or the Matrone with later mythological and folkloric characters. And indeed, when I'm discussing the Indo-European solar deities, that's something, that tool is essential to our understanding or reconstruction of what may have been sort of the, Indo-European or these earlier sort of religious themes, that then reflect in later folkloric and mythological tradition. However, with reference to Modronecht and the goddess Eostre, which is of course my particular interest, we shouldn't really ignore the strongest and most obvious connection, which is their shared context. Modronecht and Eostre appear in the same chapter, De Mensibus Anglorum, the English months, of the same work, De Temporum Ratione, The Reckoning of Time, by the same author, of course, the Venerable Bede, and on the same subject, which is, of course, the Anglo-Saxon year. So I would start with, in terms of, looking at these two, Modronecht and Eostre, with what Bede tells us. We know that Modronecht and Eostre was celebrated at specific times of year. Modronecht preceded or was the night before the Anglo-Saxon New Year on the 25th of December, so it was the eve of the New Year, which was also reckoned to be the winter solstice. And Eoster Moneth was the fourth lunar month of the Anglo-Saxon year and would regularly have commenced on or about the spring equinox. So this is one of the illustrations from my book, which is a sort of reconstruction of the Anglo-Saxon pagan year as we have it from Bede and sort of later West Saxon sort of documents attesting to the month names and seasonal names. So we have the sort of 12 lunar months there. That Bede records, but in their West Saxon form. We have the 4 seasons surrounding them, and then we have the midwinter festival, Eula, the midwinter, and the Litha, the midsummer festival. But if we superimpose onto that the solstices and the equinoxes, so the winter solstice at Eula and the summer solstice at Litha, and then the spring and autumn equinoxes, and then look at the positions of Modronecht and Eostre, we see that they sit before and just after, so just before the winter solstice and just after the spring equinox, or just at the spring equinox. So as we've already seen, we know the specific times of year when these two celebrations took place. But why? What could a mother's night signify before the new year and the winter solstice? And what could an Eastern month or an Eostre's month signify at the equinox and the beginning of the summer half year? We know that the Modronecht festivities culminated at the beginning or birth of the new year and the rebirth of the sun. But he tells us that the months of Yuli, the two months that straddled the winter solstice, derive their name from the day when the sun turns back and begins to increase. And because one of the months preceded the solstice, and the other followed the solstice. So the point at which the sun drops down to its lowest point in the sky and then returns, is reborn, and sort of begins to grow. The length of daylight steadily begins to increase. And the Ostra's festivities commenced at the equinoctial eastern sunrise, when the light finally conquers darkness with the longer daylight hours. And again, Bede tells us that originally the pagan Anglo-Saxons divided their year into just two seasons, into summer and winter, with 6 months given over to each. So 6 months when the days were shorter than the nights, and then 6 months when the days were longer than the nights. So with this, I think we can see that the position of those two festivals, of Modrenecht and Eostre na Monnath, the month of Eostre, I think, would be the first port of call. That's what we should be looking at, their context and how they fitted into that solar year. So I think for me, I'd say if we were looking for an older stratum of mythology, I would suggest that Modrenecht and Eostre are better explained as Germanic reflexes of the Indo-European solar deities, the solstitial rebirth of the sun and the equinoctial rising of the dawn goddess, than as triads of mother goddesses such as the Matrone Austria Henne. That being said, of course, the Modrenecht, there is nothing to stop, of course, the Modrenecht from being a triad of goddesses at the winter solstice. But within the evidence that, within the context of the evidence, Modrenecht and Eostre, I would be looking more towards the solar calendar to explain their roles and their function before moving on to other parallels. So that's just one response. I haven't sort of, taken it any further than that, but it was just a thing that came out to me when I was looking at your presentation. But it's meant as sort of helpful rather than constructive criticism. Rather,
Sure,
I
sure.
think that your book has great merits, and I do look forward to it. But I would suggest that certainly with reference to Modrenecht and Eostre, that the calendar would be a starting point in understanding what they signify. So thank you for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that brilliant response. Um, is there more you want to say about your book before we take a
Well, I
break?
mean, I put up the summary to my book, but really, I think, this afternoon I thought, Stephen had given such a full sort of, a lecture. I wanted to respond specifically to, the element within it where I felt it's very related to my book, and, where I felt that possibly something I could sort of, just inject into the discussion. But yes, I mean, thank you. I mean, I put up the cover of the book, and with this sort of the one of the two abstracts. The book looks at Easter and tries to look at it in the round and in the broadest possible sense, but without hopefully going in, frightening off the reader in terms of its length. I think one of the reviewers said that it was wonderfully concise, which I was so pleased by, because because it looks at, let's say, the origins of the Easter festival rooted in Judaism, and then the Jewish Passover, and then the Christian Feast of the Resurrection, but looks at how that sort of, in Europe was established in the late Roman Empire and in the British Isles in particular. And then how, let's say, with the Anglo-Saxon settlement, it gained a new name, Iastron, and that Bede tells us that this name came from sort of Eostre, a goddess that had been of great importance to these people. And then we have, this other name in Germany, Ostern, in Old High German Osterun, and then the discussion as to how it is in both England and Germany. We have two very, very different names, whereas in the rest of the Christian world, they tend to name it, as a Pascha or Passen or something like that, after the Jewish Passover. So it goes into that, and then following up some of the sort of, discussions about, let's say, why, let's say, how this has come about, how it might be rooted in, let's say, different sort of, these different sort of languages, and then finally, let's say, looking at, let's say, whether it does have a possible relationship with the Matrone Austria Henne, which Stephen has introduced us to, And then finally, taking some ideas that Richard North, UCL, had proposed more than 10 years ago now, suggesting that a unique theatre or type structure or assembly structure at the Royal Site of Yevering in Northumberland might have some astronomical significance related to the equinox and related to Eostre. I've taken that a little further as well and explored that. So I hope it's an enjoyable read, and I hope it sort of takes people on a bit of a journey, really. So thank you. Yeah, that's probably enough.
Well, that was perfect, Richard. Thank you very much. It is a wonderfully concise book, and I would say remarkably learned and remarkably accessible. I think you can come into the book knowing nothing and finish the book knowing a lot, and have a good time along the way. So I do recommend it.